There's a new sheriff in town, and the big word is tariffs. So we're going to talk about that this week on the podcast, what it means, what they are, and what the outlook might be. So let's get into it this week here on the Wealthy Pilots Podcast.
We've got some turbulence up ahead.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome into the show. Thanks for hanging out with Scott and I as we talk investing, finance, retirement. And Scott, my friend, I know we're a couple of weeks behind, I guess, the main conversations around tariffs, but they're not going anywhere. So we figured we might as well chat about them a little bit this week on the show because they're going to be around for a little bit, I think. So we're going to see this. They've been around, actually, for a very long time. We're going to get into that as well. But how you doing? You doing all right?
Doing great, man. Loving it.
So what you think about the whole tariff conversation?
You know, it's I feel like it's one of those things. It's like a good news, bad news story, right? Where, tariffs are not new.
Nope.
A little factoid here. I know we looked into the President Washington, George Washington.
That's right.
Signed the first one into law in 1789, 5% flat rate on all imported goods. And that was
from England.
From England, right?
Which made total sense, right?
At the time,
considering the recent battles we had just had with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they're a political tool to impose, our political will on the countries that we, trade with.
And let's look at it from a different standpoint too, versus sanctions, right? Like newer, sanctions, you'll hear arguments, well, tariffs hurt the people. Well, no, not nearly not like sanctions. Sanctions definitely can hurt. When we put economic sanctions on a whole country, it definitely can kind of hit the whole populace, right?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas, tariffs are on specific products, right? So if you don't want to pay more for a particular product, it's got a tariff on it, just don't buy it.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a little bit more leverage, I think, for the consumer here.
Well, and I know like my girls were pretty disappointed about one of the tariffs because they were specifically targeting some of these direct to consumer companies from China. One of them was Shein.
Okay.
And, Shein basically manufactures this stuff and sends it right through the U.S. Postal Service to the consumer.
Okay.
And all of these packages coming through USPS were not getting hit with any of the normal duty charges or whatever the case is.
Right.
And so, there's a couple of companies like that were part of the Trump tariffs towards China.
Yeah.
And so, Shein's website's got all this information on it. The prices are going up and what have you. So my daughter's chore money goes towards Shein typically. And so, it was a real world example of where it can impact pricing for sure. It can drive prices to go up. It can impact the bottom line or the profits of companies.
Sure.
And so, does it have an economic impact? Absolutely. And if you look at how much tariffs were talked about the previous 6 quarters in Fortune 500 companies' quarterly, board report outs,
right,
or earnings calls, tariffs were hardly mentioned at all.
Well, and the funny thing with that is, so again, to your point, they've been around forever, right?
Yeah.
Trump put them in his first administration, and the Biden administration left them in, especially on the ones on China. They didn't change them. And just real fast, and we'll put a link in there for folks, but they want to see, but they can bring actual revenue into the country, right? So second quarter to third quarter of 2018 into 2019, we brought an additional $40 billion in off tariffs on China. So, they can have a real impact.
Yeah, for sure. And ultimately what they're really trying to do is make sure that we are imposing fair trade.
Yeah. And fair leverage.
Fair leverage across, the global ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that said, it can still be punitive in nature at sometimes too, right? And I think that's what some of them have really targeted China about. Like, hey, if you want to steal our intellectual property on some of our goods and services, we're going to impose these tariffs on the goods that you're sending back to the U.S. So, ultimately, I think, you see the market react, which is really, I think, what most people care about.
Right.
The market reacts how it always reacts when it's getting unsteady news, I'll say. And that's what's, I think, caused a lot of the choppiness we've seen in the market here recently. It's just been because there's, like you said, there's a new sheriff in town.
Yeah.
He's moving very fast.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unknowns, and those unknowns lead to unpredictable things unfolding. And the market does not like unpredictability.
And of course,
things to be predictable, current, stable.
And we talked a couple of weeks ago, and of course, tech is massively overweighted, and that's not helping the conversation either, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a bit of a bubble happening in a couple of sectors, so it certainly adds to it. And so at the time we're taping this podcast, Scott, and there could be some other news by the time we drop this particular podcast, but by the time we're taping this, he came out the other day, I think it was just 2 days ago, and said he's decided on basically just quid pro quo on a tariff. So if China's hitting us with a 15% on whatever, then we'll hit them with a 15% on that same item, right? So it'll just kind of be a vis-a-vis kind of thing there. So, we'll see how that all plays out. And I think obviously the initial conversation that was used against, Mexico and China, and Canada, some of that's really about more of border control. We kind of saw coming to the, meeting of the minds on that. So we'll see how it all plays out. But I think people want to know in the end, does it totally affect us in the economy? A little yes and a little no, right? You don't really know for sure until you kind of see how it all shakes out. What are you purchasing, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think too, this is where, some good investment behaviors like diversification are really important, right?
Yeah,
where,
indeed.
Hey, when I'm just continuing to buy good assets that have good long-term track records of appreciating over time. I know if you're diversified, the downside is, there's always going to be a dog in the portfolio, period.
Sure. Yeah.
But hey, when I got something in there that's a dog, I can look at it as, hey, I'm buying this on the cheap versus right now, if you're buying tech, you're buying it the most expensive it's ever been.
Yeah.
But even still, most of the tech that you're buying today, 10 years from now, you'd probably wish you could come back and buy it at these prices, right? This is kind of how markets work. And so it tends to the tariff discussion is definitely going to have some short-term implications to revenues, profits, maybe even some negative impacts to inflation. But it's going to offset that with some revenue that comes to the country as well, and hopefully
possible job growth. I mean, think that's part of the big deal too, right? I'm seeing this from all of my different friends around the world that I chat with on different platforms. It's like, hey, we're going to start buying more Canadian products because they live in Canada. Great, you should absolutely do that, right? To avoid the tariffs, we should buy more products made in America, and obviously companies. The idea is that I think each nation hopefully maybe being a little bit to stand on its own a bit more. You still got to have trade. Yeah. But there's nothing wrong with also buying in your backyard.
Well, and if you see U.S.-based companies becoming more intentional with manufacturing items here in the U.S. too, I mean, that's
creates jobs.
Yeah.
Creates the economy, right?
Yep. So
GDP
there can be a lot of good that comes to it in terms of, making the playing field a little bit more fair for all companies.
And countries, possibly.
Absolutely. And, that tends to be good for the global markets and the global economy. So, which is also why it's not bad to be an international investor too. I mean, we like having a little bit of international holdings inside of a portfolio.
Sure.
If you're owning just the S&P 500, that's been pretty good the last couple of years, but it's had periods where it hasn't. We've had 20-year periods where the S&P has underperformed international.
And it is a global market still. I mean, I think even with some of the things Trump's trying to do, I think we're still seeing that it's still a global economy.
For sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean, all that said, I think it's short-term news. Give it 1 or 2 years and you would not even remember this. This is a flash in the pan. It's not anything to make any significant investment decisions on. Unless you're, trying to be somebody who's timing the market and all that. And, that's,
I think we see it at the much higher level, right? But a little bit of trickle down potentially, but I think most of that stuff happens. I mean, again, to my point about how the impact in his first term, right? And how it carried over through Biden's term, there wasn't a massive, I don't think most people felt it massively. A lot of the inflation we saw there was clearly from all the government, spending and the printing that we did for, the COVID, relief and things of that nature. So,
well, and you saw a lot of the early tariffs where, hey, we're going to do a 25% on Mexico and Canada until they get this border security under control.
And they immediately jumped on
did.
It.
And again, that was like, hey, that's a way to impose my political will more than it is even having anything to do with the economics or the companies or the products that are being.
Yeah, it's a bargaining tool versus sanctions or obviously conflict, right?
Yep.
So
you got it. So.
All right. Well, so from the investor standpoint, don't overreact. Just like anything on the news, just like anything that the governments and the institutional, investing's doing, keep it smart, keep it simple, keep it safe for yourself, and always work with a qualified professional and talk with someone before you take any action, like Scott. So if you need some help, links in the show descriptions below. Click on that. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Help support the channel. We certainly appreciate that as well. And we'll see you next time here on the Wealthy Pilots Podcast. Thank you, my friend.
We'll see you later.
Always good stuff. We'll catch you later on, right here on the program. See you.
Information is for illustrative purposes only and does not constitute tax, investment, or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified investment, legal, or tax professional before taking any action.